Hello, I'm Kenza Gray, co-owner and curator at Grey Area Gallery, and welcome to Landmark, our first exhibition of 2026. It's been a really popular show with a lot of great feedback, so I'm excited to show you around so that you can see why. Landmark showcases the work of 5 Norfolk-based artists: Claire Kansick, Bob Catchpole, James Hunter, Beth Morrison, and Louise Doherty. They're all very different and unique artists ranging from a wide span of mediums, but they all have this tie of being inspired by our county, Norfolk. So when curating this exhibition, we wanted the viewer to walk into this vast space and yet be drawn closer by the forests of Beth. And as you are, you're flanked by the really bold, bright colours of James' suburban scenes and the contrasting blues and greens and open spaces of Louise Doherty's fields. And you're drawn closer into the forest and see the words of Landmark by Bob Catchpole, which is a piece that's never been exhibited and a piece that really inspired a lot of our thoughts around Landmark as a title and the word being split into 2, and these ideas of land and marking. And all of this is playing as the viewer walks in, and I think beautifully most people are drawn straight to the forests. So Beth Morrison is a Norfolk-based artist who originally graduated with a BA in jewellery design. I think that really highlights her consistent interest in the miniature and small collections of things, from the turned out pockets to a collection of random objects in a matchbox. These are all things that Beth is inspired by and highlight her inspiration to draw people closer to look at the little details of things. So her ceramic trees are obviously inspired by her surroundings in Norfolk, but they also have a universal and illustrative quality. Within their whimsical nature, people have really been drawn to the colours and the contrasts, the different shapes, and yet they have a really uniformed quality to them. Beth cites that her trees are inspired by the tin and plastic trees that are found within model villages. And I think that when you're stood like this, immersed within them, it's hard to not get lost. What we've noticed a lot of viewers doing is looking for the different shapes and sizes and discovering the unique ones, or the different ones that look like they're blowing in the wind, or noticing that there's the flowers or the bushes. And I think that from a distance it just seems like they're all uniformed. And yet when you get closer, you really notice the detail that she puts into each piece, and that they are so unique, just like trees themselves, that no matter what she creates, they cannot be the same. And it's been really fun to watch people pick out the pieces that would go well together, or the sort of little worlds that's on each plinth. When playing with the actual display, we had the idea to incorporate mirrors, but particularly as you come around the display, so it's not the first thing you see, but instead it creates a distance to the forest. So although there is obviously a vast amount of pieces here, to give the idea that there's more, that this forest is endless, this world is immersive for the viewers. I think that it's been super great to see people walking around the display and discovering more of her works. After the initial entrance, then they are greeted with James Hunter's suburban paintings. James is a Norwich-based artist who predominantly works in oils, capturing these fleeting moments within suburban life. James is particularly interested in capturing the beauty that we can find within ordinary everyday life. So moments that most of us would just walk past, a sock hanging on a linen line or an empty football pitch. James sees the interest and intrigue in those scenes, and within his paintings, he creates these tightly cropped compositions that exclude the actual presence of humans, but there is that presence of them within the architecture or the structures that he's showcasing. In particular, what people have been drawn to with this body of James's work is the bright colours and the contrasts that he pulls into each piece. So taking the work behind me, Orbit, it's this really bold and one-dimensional blue sky, contrasted with the beautiful shadows of greens and yellows that he creates on the tree. And again, this really capturing moment of that sunset that actually, if you've been around Norfolk, we do have these really beautiful orange and vast sunset. I think it's captured in a really unique way, like I say, contrasting that sort of two-dimensional element with the 3D perspective. What I also think people have been drawn to in his works is the compositions that he's choosing. So the viewpoint that he's throwing the viewer into. So here we're looking up at the sky, here we're looking down at the ground. He's really immersing us within this landscape from his perspective. And his perspective is to stop and think about those moments that most people wouldn't look at. Within his compositions, we notice that he likes to contrast these flowing elements. So over there we have the smooth hill contrasted with the goalposts, which are straight lines cutting through the canvas. Here we have the flowingness of the natural tree contrasted with the wire shooting straight across the sky, or the straight lines of the house there. And I think that this allows the eye to fall around the canvas and also just showcases the way in which we do live within this natural element in the world. Humans create these straight lines, but the nature around us is flowing. Also with his works, we see this intense use of detail. So with the pieces behind me that feature the grass, his brushstrokes are minute. But then, like I say, some of his other pieces bring in these big, bold sort of splashes of colour that don't have any detail. And I think this contrast makes his work really intriguing and interesting. And people have really been sort of drawn to that aspect of his work. On the right side of the gallery, opposite James Hunter's works, we featured the landscapes of Louise Doherty. So Louise Doherty is a Norfolk-based artist who creates predominantly by walking around the landscapes and immersing herself within them. She combines these beautiful paintings on board here with the threads below in this body of work to explore this dynamic experience that we have within the landscape. Firstly, it's been really interesting to have the works in the space, to have the threads here moving as people walk past or as a bit of breeze comes into the gallery. In this way, the threads beautifully contrast the painting above. So the paintings are static, but they are depicting the reeds and the grass of this landscape, which we all know within the landscape the wind would constantly be moving them. And I think that the threads, just on this first level of encountering Louise's works, showcase this and bring this dynamic element to the piece. Looking past the threads of Louise's works, the paintings themselves are amazingly beautiful. They feature the huge skies of Norfolk, captured in such a beautiful, real, and connected to the landscape way. The paintings themselves are amazingly executed. The details that she gets within the works and her use of subtle brushwork to create the skylines, the clouds, and the really detailed bottom half of each work with the grass. They really are strong paintings, and bringing that element with this sort of vast white expanse of the threads below creates this contrast within the work itself. One work of Louise's that I wanted to quickly highlight is the piece behind me, Reeds and Lines. I think that this is a really interesting work by Louise. We get her typical vast skyline and iconic threads along the bottom here. But we get this element of human presence, the pylon lines here. We've situated this across the room from James Hunter's works, which particularly feature the same lines. And I think it's really interesting to show that these are contemporary scenes, you know. Yes, they are of the natural landscape, but there's bringing this element of human nature into it and this presence of Norfolk, you know. Yes, we are a county with a huge amount of natural scenes and scenery, but there is always this presence of urban scenery. Lastly, with Louise's works, we've been having a lot of intrigue and interest in this combination of the paintings and the threads. The conversations we've had with visitors of the exhibition have been really centered around this idea of roots and this connection to our heritage through physicality of roots, but also the sort of metaphor of roots and being tied to the heritage here. Norfolk has a long history of textiles, so Norwich used to be the second capital of England, and a lot of its wealth came from the textile industry. These idea of roots being textiles are really important to the works. but also this idea of the female experience. Textile arts often talk about the idea that women's work is often tied up with textiles and threads and sewing. So there's these double meanings within the ideas of roots and the use of textiles in the pieces. I wanted to highlight these two next to each other to show the contrasting ways in which Louise uses the threads. So in the piece behind me, we have the very linear and sort of almost more static, but they're not as they move, pieces of threads here, but contrasted with the really tangled pieces here. And these reflect the paintings above. In this piece, there is clearly a storm coming on, and that is reflected in the roots here and the threads. You know, they're tangled, they've been in the breeze. Whereas these pieces, we're on a really sunny day, they're more linear and haven't experienced that sort of tangledness of the wind. But I also just wanted to highlight that we've put these pieces in a passageway of the exhibition. So as people walk through, you see the threads gently sway, and it's this dynamic element that have really been capturing people. Along the back wall here, we feature the works of Bob Catchpole. So Bob is a Norfolk born and based sculptor who comes from a long line of Norfolk farmers. Bob's lineage and family are really important in inspiring this body of work. He often mentions his uncles and his fathers who are farming, but also going into his grandfather's shed as a child and looking up at the walls and this vast array of tools that surrounded him. Bob originally taught himself to gas weld and created absurd tools which were inspired by surrealist objects. But then, as this body of work grew, he began to incorporate found objects of the tool heads, some of which were found at flea markets in Norfolk and in France by his sister. And then he would take each piece and create the handle. So he learned to carve from the Norfolk oak, and it's this combination of the found objects that again draw this lineage and heritage with the playful and creative side of the handles that make his pieces so striking. I think what's been really fun in the show is to see people walk round this central wall and they begin to laugh and smile and point out the different pieces and imagine how he created them. But I think that this fun, whimsical nature is contrasted with this second layer that people realize the skill and intensity in creating the handles. He can't just bend the wood, you know, these are all hand carved and created. In speaking to him, he explained to us, but when you're carving against the grain, the piece becomes quite brittle. Although this is a solid bit of oak, it can chip and splinter and break in certain ways. So to know the wood and know the material and how to best work with it, but also the ideas that come into each piece, is again showing off the skill that he's able to execute them. When thinking about curating the space, what really struck us was when Bob was talking about this tool shed and the idea that everyone, I think, can visualize walking into that space and having the vast array of tools hanging there. So we wanted to give this idea in this display as if it was a tool shed at the back here. What was really fun to play with was the different shapes and the different styles in which Bob works. From the words here, like fork, or the chain of Rubens' fork and spade there, or the very linear pieces like Forkman. And I think that this shows the diversity within this body of work. You know, there's the different skills needed for different pieces. I think it's worth highlighting a couple of pieces, one of which is Rubens' fork and Rubens' spade, which were inspired by Bob's uncle, and we've included a little bit of text for people to engage with that lineage again. Bob cites that his uncle Reuben was a farmer. He would often be found carving and whittling chains out of sticks and branches. So these pieces here are in homage to him. It's been really great to see people realize again that this is whittled and carved out of one piece of wood. And just to show you the movement of the piece when you are able to see them, I think it has a really amazing quality to it, in that we all know how a spade like this should feel and react to the human body. It's solid. But when you do hold these pieces or interact with them, they don't interact in the way that a tool should. And I think that it's this that Bob really enjoys within his works, that they surprise people. Another piece to highlight is the piece behind me, Landmark. People have been really drawn to this work for its very natural and almost organic feel. So the curves within the wood feel as if he has literally bent it, with people saying it looks like balloons or a more malleable material like that. So it's been really great to have those conversations with people that this is carved out of one large chunk of wood. And this whole body of work highlights Bob's talent within woodworking and the skills and intrigue that can be found within this medium of art. In a way, we split this exhibition into two halves by creating this dividing wall in the middle. So as the visitors come round, and just after getting their first glimpse of Bob Catchpole's tools, they see this section that we've created of Claire Cansick's work. So Claire is a Norfolk born and based artist, primarily inspired by the concern that she has for the natural world around us. Within her works, we're immersed into the sea. So she says that growing up on the coastline here in Norfolk, she has continuously seen the sea as both a place for adventure and wonder, but also as an untamed wilderness. And I think that's the impression that a viewer instantly gets with her works as they come round this corner. Within her works, Claire weaves an idea of identity, solitude, and the unknown. People are drawn in by the beautiful colours in which she uses and the texture within her brushstrokes. You're drawn in to look quite closely at the marks that create these waves that we're really immersed into. So Claire goes out sea swimming almost every day in the morning, and she takes her GoPro with her, taking pictures as she swims amongst these waves and loses herself in that landscape. Then she returns back to the studio to paint these scenes, playing with the perspectives, and often we see the sort of shoreline or the boats in the distance. But what she really wants to achieve is throwing the audience into this landscape that she sees. This perspective that Claire paints with is quite different to, I think, what we would expect to see in a seascape. Quite often, an artist will stand on the shoreline and paint the sea from that perspective. By bringing us into the sea with her, there is a sense of unease, but there is also a sense of beauty. And I think that a viewer can put whatever perspective they have of the sea on it. In one piece, you can see this moment of being out of your depth, or you can see a moment of being lost or freedom. Whatever you feel within that moment, I think that it's beautiful that we can put our own perspectives into it. Within the pieces that we have in this exhibition by Claire, at a first glance, you can just know what you're seeing, thinking that you're just looking at that seascape or that wave. But as you look closer, within all of them, there's not a hidden element, but a further element. We have the snakes beneath the surface. We have the portrait of the person who is Claire's shadow, sort of imposed onto the wave. And in the piece behind me, Yet the Sea Never Overflows, is a really intriguing sort of engulfed face within the wave. And I know that when we spoke with Claire about this piece, she mentioned that she was thinking about this idea that if the environment, or the sea in particular, had a face and we could see the emotion, would we connect more with it, and would we feel bad about the things we're doing to it, or would we want to connect with it in a further way? Also within these works, there's a unified colour palette, but also it's quite different within the work. So we have the darker piece, which we used for the poster, and then we have the brighter pieces over here. But there is that unified sort of greens and blues that the sea around here has. One of the pieces that has caught the most attention by Claire in this exhibition is the piece behind me, Adorn Her Silken Skin. I believe that with this piece, people have really been drawn in to the colours and the contrast within the colours. So the gradient that is created across this piece, from the sort of brightness on the horizon line there, down to the deepness of the colours of the greens and blues at the bottom here. It really gives this impression of the deep vastness of the sea. And in the distance, we have the boat on the shoreline, which is almost illuminated in this brightness of the sky there. And I think for me, I see that as a glimmer of hope in the distance. But someone else could interpret that in a very different way. I think that the texture in this piece as well has really been allowing people to get close to the piece and look at these very thick and very bold and confident brushstrokes that Claire effortlessly creates the sea with. It creates this sense of movement across the piece, the way that the water flows, but it is not literal. She's not totally recreating the waves. It's the feeling and the essence of being immersed within this vast expanse of water that Claire so effortlessly recreates on the piece here. What has really been captivating the audiences to this exhibition has been just this, the contrasted way in which Claire skillfully recreates these moments of unease and beauty within her paintings. It's been really great to include her works in the exhibition, and people have really been responding to it and interpreting it in different manners, in a way that they're allowed to put their own experiences with the sea onto it. But Claire does this by showcasing her experiences and I think it creates a really powerful and beautiful body of work. We have now closed the doors on Landmark. Thank you for watching this video. I hope it's given you an insight into the exhibition and that you've learned a bit more about the artists and their works. It's been a really popular exhibition and the feedback we've received about all of the artists involved has been amazing. If anything has caught your eye or you'd like any more information, please do drop us an email or reach out to us on social media. Thank you for watching along, and we hope to see you all next time.